Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is the Current Podcast.
It's not easy when your kid heads out on a big trip, especially when it's to space.
I'm very happy that they decided not to send her down right away. You never know. There were 2 accidents with the shuttle already. I sure as heck wouldn't want that to happen to my daughter.
Bonnie Pandia is Sunny Williams' mom. Williams and fellow astronaut Butch Wilmore have been stranded on the International Space Station since early June. Boeing's Starliner spacecraft brought them up there for what was meant to be an 8-day trip, but there were issues with the Starliner, and a few days became weeks. The pair gave a press conference from the ISS in July.
We are having a great time here on ISS. Butch and I have been up here before, and it feels like coming back home. It feels good to float around. It feels good to be in space and work up here with the International Space Station team. So, yeah, it's great to be up here. So I'm not complaining. Butch isn't complaining that we're here for a couple weeks, extra weeks.
Well, those weeks are months now. NASA recently announced that the astronauts won't return until next year. Starliner is set to come home without them in September, and their return trip is planned to be on a SpaceX aircraft. Elon Musk's SpaceX is also set to launch its Polaris Dawn mission, which hopes to feature the first ever spacewalk by an all-civilian crew. In a few minutes, we'll talk more about this new era of the space race. But first, I'm joined by Dave Williams. He's a retired Canadian astronaut who has been to the International Space Station and the first non-American to hold a senior management position within NASA. He's walked in space 3 times, more than any other Canadian. Good morning, Dave.
Good morning.
Really honored to be talking to you this morning. You know both Sunny and Butch. What's your sense of how they're taking the news that they won't be home until at least February?
Well, I know them both very well. They're both fantastic astronauts, and I think what we heard from Sunny sums it up really well, that despite the unexpected nature of this, they've been there before, they're used to working in space on the space station, and they'll have a lot of things to do between now and February.
I'm sure. Do you think it was the right decision?
Absolutely no question. It's about controlling risk, and this is a test flight. So with all the discussion about the thrusters, we have to remember it was a test flight of the vehicle, and the best decision to make was to be able to leave the crew on the space station, come back with Crew 9, and then bring the vehicle back autonomously. They're still going to get the data that they would have got before.
Indeed, but why was transporting them home on the Starliner deemed too risky, do you think?
Well, ideally, we want a spacecraft where all the thrusters that control the position of the spacecraft are functioning properly. Thruster issues have gone back right to the beginning of the space program. We had a challenge in Gemini 8 with a stuck thruster. We had problems in the space shuttle with thrusters. And it's not surprising that these early test flights, we're going to see issues with thrusters again. So the team on the ground wanted to make sure that they're controlling risk to the best possible level while achieving mission objectives. And the best way to control the risk is to take the crew out of the vehicle, bring the vehicle back autonomously. They're still collecting the data, and then bring the crew back with the Dragon vehicle.
Dave, while you were at NASA, you were part of a team that would be making exactly these types of decisions, of calls about missions. How does that kind of a decision get made? What are the big considerations?
Well, we have the mission management team that meets before a mission and then every day during a mission. And the mission management team is made up of the senior leaders of every different engineering discipline, and contractors are represented as well. And we weigh whatever the issue is. We look at the risks. We look at the benefits of making the decision. And the goal overall is to control the risk to as low as we can achieve. In this case, Butch and Sunny actually joined the mission management team meeting from space, and they were able to participate and give their perspective to the decision makers as well.
So they're inputting their recommendations and what they're going through.
Yes.
So how much does NASA prepare an astronaut mentally for a change of plans like this? Clearly, they've been highly trained for the unexpected, that space.
Well, for years, NASA's been working very hard on what we call expeditionary behavior. We learned about that with the initial long-duration flights to the Russian Mir space station that were done in the 1990s, and that's when we started the expeditionary behavior program, giving the astronauts the tools they need to be great team players, great leaders, followers, and to be able to deal with all these unforeseen circumstances.
I want to take you back to your first spacewalk. I mean, the Polaris Dawn, the SpaceX mission carrying 4 private citizens, is set to involve the first spacewalk by a civilian crew. You've done it. What was it like, Dave?
It's one thing being in space. It's another thing sticking your head out the hatch into the vacuum of space, looking a few hundred kilometers back at the Earth. It really gets your attention, we might say. But it'll be interesting seeing how they do this spacewalk. It's very much like the Gemini spacewalks, where they depressurize the whole spacecraft and the crew members are on umbilicals to provide the life support. We had our own life support system, and we went quite a far distance away from the airlock itself.
Do you have any advice? I mean, these people are civilians, billionaire Jared Isaacman and 3 others, privately trained astronauts.
Yeah, I would recommend doing a lot of mental imagery, thinking about what that image is going to look like, looking back at the Earth, and move very slowly.
Pole, pole, as they say. Polaris Dawn was meant to launch this week, but it's been pushed back twice now, once because of a helium leak at the launch pad and once because of bad weather. It might be pushed back even more now because we heard yesterday SpaceX's Falcon 9 rockets have been grounded by U.S. officials. One toppled into the ocean Wednesday after fiery landing coming back to Earth. So what do you make of those delays?
You know, the delays, I think, are to be expected in any space program, whether it's the private or the government program. We launch when we're ready to launch, and there's many factors that go into that, ranging from the technology in the vehicle, whether the vehicle's ready, whether the weather is ready, whether the crew is ready. So there's a lot of factors that play into this. It's not like going to the airport, getting on a commercial airliner.
It isn't indeed. But what about the grounding of the Falcon 9 rockets? I mean, that could have ripple effects for a number of different space plans in the near future.
Yes, well, we'll see how that works out. You know, I think the goal would be to get it back in action as soon as possible, but we have to wait and see what they're able to discover.
And what about the growth of private space companies? I mean, we've seen a huge race now to get individuals into space, to do a lot more launches like SpaceX and many others. What's your thought about that?
You know, I think it's the dawn of a new era of space exploration. In this millennium, we will see humans becoming a spacefaring species where we live on other planets in our solar system. Elizabeth Howell and I wrote a book about this called Why Am I Taller? How Astronauts Adapt to Living in Space. And it talks about what happens when we go back to the moon and ultimately going on to Mars. So I see it as the beginning of a very exciting time.
Wow. We're going to speak to Elizabeth in a few minutes. And you have your own company, which is involving medical innovation and space exploration. You're a doctor. What do you think is the role for Canadians in this new version of the space race?
You know, I think it's a tremendous opportunity for Canada. I would love to see us become 10% players in the global space economy. Today, that's about a $350 billion economy that will grow to $1.1 trillion in the next 20 years. And I think it would be exciting to see more opportunities for Canadian companies.
10%, what are we at now?
We're a little bit less than that. I'd say we're probably around 3% or so.
So we've got some growth in your view.
Yes.
And what's at stake if we don't get involved? You know, there is some opposition to space race, the amount of money that's spent on it by some people.
You know, I think space is about the development of new technology that enables us to go to space. So to be part of the major spacefaring nations, which we currently are, but to remain part of that means that we're a nation committed to developing an economy based on innovation, as opposed to developing an economy based on consumerism. And I think this is a tremendous opportunity for Canada in the future.
I was struck by what you said, in this millennium we'll be living in space? Living like on the ISS or on Mars?
Oh, well, we'll be living on other planetary bodies. We've had humans permanently on the space station since the year 2000. So for the last 24 years, we've had humans living in space. But now we're going to see humans going back to the moon. They'll be living on the surface of the moon. We'll rotate crews like we do on the space station. And then ultimately, the same will happen with Mars, hopefully within my lifetime.
Pretty exciting, man. It's fast, isn't it? I want to ask about, finally, Sonny and Butch. Just got a minute left here, Dave. What message do you have for them? What would you tell them about the change of plans in the months ahead? And about there must be a slight level of anxiety that the plan now still may not work out exactly as planned.
You know, if I were able to chat with them today, first of all, I'd say big hello. They're doing a fantastic job. Dealing with the unanticipated is never easy, but they'll have a lot of research to do and certainly take time to look out the window and enjoy the experience.
You must be thinking a lot about them and all the people going up, given your experience.
Yes.
Dave Williams, really a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you very much. Dave Williams is a retired Canadian astronaut. He is a doctor, and he is an author of several books, including 2 with our next guest. Elizabeth Howell is a spaceflight reporter with the news publication Space.com. She's been covering the private space race as well as the Starliner mission. Good morning, Elizabeth.
Good morning.
Let's go back to June for a second. What do we know about what went wrong with Boeing's Starliner spacecraft?
Well, they launched the mission and everything was appearing to going normally until they got to the space station. But as you may have heard from astronaut Dave Williams a minute ago, it's a developmental mission, which means that they expect to find things that they were not expecting, if that makes any sense. And in this case, the unexpected arose pretty quickly because they had some problems with docking. The thrusters, or the little engines that control the spacecraft as it's moving close to the space station, they weren't coming on at the right times. There are 28 of them, and some of them, 5 of them, were not working. They did make the docking safely, but clearly after that point, NASA wanted to do a big investigation, and that begins the story that we have from today.
It sounds very expected and planned with BCD plans, but months more in space than these astronauts expected? Was that planned for?
Well, the nature of developmental missions is there is no schedule. What you're always doing is you're moving at the speed of knowledge. And when you're right at the cutting edge of science or engineering, which is literally what astronauts do from time to time, and it's sometimes what happens. So what had happened was before this mission was even launched, 3 years beforehand, NASA made sure they had extra supplies on the space station for these 2 astronauts. They made sure that they had extra spacesuits available if they had to do spacewalks. They also had tasks ready for them, such as science experiments and maintenance duties if they had some extra time. And so it certainly was built in. And it's a good thing they did that.
Indeed. Boeing is now, NASA has picked Boeing's rival SpaceX to return the 2 astronauts. What do you know about why they made that choice?
Well, NASA has 2 options to send people back and forth from the United States, and those are SpaceX and Boeing. SpaceX has been running missions since 2020 for NASA, human missions specifically. But even before that, since 2012, it's been doing cargo missions. So it has a lot of experience compared to Boeing. And as Dave Williams was mentioning earlier, there are challenges when you're making a brand new spacecraft. Thrusters are tricky. Propulsion, which is what was making the difficulties with the thrusters happen, is also very tricky, especially when it comes to helium. Helium's a light gas. It very easily leaks. So I would say that these challenges that Boeing is facing are not unexpected in a new spacecraft, but what ended up happening in this case is NASA just said, you know what, SpaceX has been sending up people since 2020. They've done something like a dozen missions in space. And so we're just going to be going with SpaceX and then working to fix the Starliner before launching again.
Elizabeth, the most recent news, and I talked to Dave briefly about this, I want your opinion. The FAA has grounded SpaceX's Falcon 9 rockets for the time being, and they use them in all kinds of different launches. How does that change the plan to bring these 2 astronauts back next year?
It's an interesting question, and there have been some people saying it's a problem almost that SpaceX is the big company that launches so many things for space. They do it very well, but we're very reliant on that one company. And I'm sure we can come up with some business cases where you have a dominant player in the market and then something changes in their supply chain or something changes with their market conditions, and then they're not maybe able to deliver, and it could cause some issues for the customers. And so SpaceX will turn it around. And given past history, they tend to to be very fast and effective on making the changes that will be needed to address the issues. But we can't say right now, sitting in this moment, exactly how long it could be. So it could be a few weeks, it could be a few months. But as I indicated, when it comes to the space station, there's at least 4 months of backup supplies up there. And there are other spacecraft, specifically from Russia, that can send up more cargo if the astronauts need it. There also are backup spacecraft from Russia that could bring people back and forth.
It's such a change, isn't it, in our lifetimes, where we're now in a place where private space companies are competing to provide space travel. How did we get here?
It's a long journey, and it's been really fun to watch because we're talking 20 years of work here, essentially, where NASA was saying, okay, we did a really good thing with the space shuttle program. It flew many, many astronauts, 135 missions. It's how we saw Canadians do our first spacewalks, our first missions even, because Marc Garneau flew on it in 1984. So it was a wonderful spacecraft, but it also was older, and we just needed to do a replacement. In the meantime, the space industry had matured so much that NASA felt that there was a confidence in having them do a little bit more, having a bit more autonomy. One thing that I think people forget is that one of the reasons SpaceX is doing so well today is NASA nurtured it, as well as obviously Boeing and other companies. But SpaceX received a lot of money in its early development from NASA and then later from the Department of Defense of the United States. When you get big contracts like that and you do well with them, you can take that money and you can plow it into other things. Mm-hmm. And that's some of the reasons that SpaceX has been launching satellites and working on a next generation spacecraft called Starship. So it's been really, really interesting to see.
Just briefly, we seem to see a lot of launches, sometimes once a week now. In fact, as early as today, Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin is set to launch its 8th manned mission with 6 people on board. How does Blue Origin fit into this space race?
Well, Blue Origin and also its competitor, Virgin Galactic, what they're doing is they're launching short-term missions for a few minutes at a time, or in Virgin's case, it's a couple of hours, but the space part's only a few minutes. And they have a couple of types of people. They have people that have clearly a lot of money or some funding to be heading up there and spending what might be about 500,000 Canadian or more for a seat, which is obviously not accessible to all of us. Luckily, there are sponsoring organizations that are working to get diverse people up there, and we have seen Black astronauts. We've seen one of the Mercury 13. Simply put, it was a woman astronaut that couldn't fly when NASA wasn't accepting women, Wally Funk. So anyway, we do see some diverse folks go up there. But we also see experiments. And one of the people flying this morning is a NASA-funded researcher who's going to be putting an experiment up there for a few minutes and learning something from it. So I think that because it's just the beginning, it's hard to predict where it could go next. But if we can expand the number of people going to space, the types of people going to space, the diversity, and also get some experiments going, surely we can find some benefit.
Elizabeth, in the last minute we have, space tourism is criticized sometimes as a luxury only the very, very wealthy can afford. Do you think that will change as the space race intensifies?
I think it could change, but I think that just like any other venture, we need to make sure that we're thinking very critically about what types of people are getting the opportunities and how to be increasing it for those groups that historically have not. Luckily, there is funding available for a select number of individuals from underrepresented groups that have been able to fly on Blue Origin and also on Virgin Galactic. And so I do hope to see more of that in the future.
It's a fascinating time. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much.
Elizabeth Howell is a spaceflight reporter with the news publication space.com, and we reached her this morning in Ottawa. An update to this interview, Blue Origin's manned mission did in fact launch this morning.